Hello and welcome back to the History of Bangalore. I am Ramjee Chandran, here with episode 107 of season 3. In the last episode, we watched as the British, defeated by Tipu in the Second Anglo-Mysore War, signed the Treaty of Bangalore on 11th March 1784, but with the honest assessment that neither side believed the peace would hold. In this episode, I will walk you through my analysis, not so much about what Tipu did with the interim, but more importantly, at the man himself. At the human who understood with perfect clarity that he was all alone. The alliances that might have saved Mysore had either betrayed him or had just dissolved or never materialized. And Tipu had spent 15 years trying by every diplomatic means available to change that fact. He never succeeded, but he never stopped trying. But before I do that, as always, first a word of thanks to my sponsors, the Prestige Group, for their corporate support. They make this podcast possible. Building cities one landmark at a time, they transform dreams into reality. You can be a part of the future. Simply add prestige to your life. So in my forthcoming book, The History of Bangalore, which by the way I have finished writing and it's due for release later this year, is a chapter titled The Loneliness of Tipu Sultan. Now I named the title of this episode the same because that title earns its place here. The loneliness of Tipu that I speak of is not temperamental or a psychological assessment of the man. I'm not qualified to do that. But I speak of a loneliness that was structural. It was the consequence of a series of political realities, events that Tipu Sultan had not caused but could not reverse. And that story begins with the Mughals. Soon after his accession in 1783, Tipu made a pragmatic move. He approached the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II in Delhi and offered him a large sum of money. This was a peshkash, which in Persian is a formal presentation, and the money was in tribute in exchange for a sanad, or the royal grant of the whole Carnatic, and a high imperial rank. This was a conventional request. Rulers in the 18th century sought Mughal legitimation as a matter of course, not because the Mughals really held any real power, but because their imprimatur or seal or stamp still carried legal and symbolic weight across the subcontinent. Shah Alam may have been inclined to accept Tipu's request, but the British blocked it. They used their influence over the Mughal acting chief minister Majud ad-Dawla to ensure that Tipu's petition was denied. Tipu, who had gone to Delhi with money and a genuine attempt at securing legitimacy for a domain that had already been his in every practical way, was turned away, at British instruction, by a court that Tipu already privately regarded as no more than a puppet. What was Tipu's response? It was not an effort in more diplomacy, it was to become defiant. If the Mughals would not appoint him emperor because they were beholden to the British, he decided that he would do it himself. So in 1786, he appointed himself the formal ruler of Mysore and assumed the title Badshah or Emperor. Badshah is a title traditionally reserved for the Mughal sovereign. This was a direct affront to the Mughal emperor. And Tipu did not stop there. He ordered that the khutbah, the Friday sermon, should be read in his own name rather than that of the Mughal emperor, as had been done by tradition. Observers at the time, contemporary observers, called this the climax of his arrogance. Tipu called it the truth. Not only that, he publicly stated that those who still included Shah Alam's name in the khutbah were, in his words, idiots acting through ignorance, because the emperor was a mere cipher, a dependent of the infidels, meaning the British, and living as a prisoner of the Marathas on a monthly wage. Now, he was not wrong, but being right about a thing and being politically wise about a thing are not the same. In rejecting the Mughals, Tipu closed one possible avenue of legitimacy and opened himself to the accusation of overreach from courts that still took Mughal protocol seriously. And not only that, He just made it very easy to play into the hands of the British, who used this kind of thing to build the whole narrative that Tipu Sultan's regime was not legitimate, so acts of war were justified. And if all this wasn't enough, Tipu did not stop there either. He did something more. He minted new coins and sent them to Shah Alam as a formal offering. But these coins carried his own name and proclamations of divine authority, and the coins omitted the Mughal's name entirely. The Mughal court, as can be expected, received them with, and again the records show, impotent rage. The coins were a calculated insult disguised as a courtesy, and Tipu knew exactly what he was doing. Now, having shut the door on the Mughals, he looked elsewhere for legitimacy, and he thought he could find this overseas, in sultanates, for example, Turkey. So in 1785, he sent a high-powered embassy to Istanbul, to the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid I, who was the caliph of the Muslim world at the time. Tipu's logic was indisputable. If the Mughals were finished, bypass them entirely. Go to the higher Islamic authority in the world, get the caliph's recognition. Make Mysore a sovereign state in the eyes of every Muslim kingdom on earth, and make the case simultaneously for an Ottoman-Mysore alliance against the British. The Ottoman Sultan received the embassy. He gave Tipu permission to assume the title of an independent king and have the khutbah read in his name. Now, this recognition mattered because it was real. So Tipu became Badshah, not through Mughal grace, but through his own initiative and by the authority of the most respected Islamic institution in the world at the time. But, there is a but, that's all the Ottomans gave him. And this is a crucial qualification. Recognition without military backing is like having a flag without a flagpole. The Ottomans offered lip service, but not troops, no fleet, no material commitment of any kind. And their recognition was theological and formal, not strategic or of any real use. And the British, who had extensive commercial and diplomatic relationships across the Ottoman Empire, were entirely capable of managing the implications. An Ottoman letter recognizing Tipu Sultan as Badshah did not move a single British soldier back across the eastern passes. What the Ottoman Gambit did do, and this is important, was it deepened Tipu's isolation in his own backyard. He had now publicly rejected the Mughals, alienated the Mysore royal family by not appointing them to the throne, and positioned himself as a sovereign answerable to no Indian authority. The Marathas regarded this with deep suspicion. The Nizam of Hyderabad regarded this with hostility. And Lakshmi Ammani, the Dowager Maharani of the Wadayar dynasty, the woman who had been plotting the restoration of her family ever since 1782, watched it all carefully from her constrained circumstances and kept filing away every single event. Tipu was becoming, step by step, a man surrounded by followers, and followers, unlike friends, do not warn you when the walls are about to collapse. I will be back after this commercial break, and let's talk more about the isolation and the loneliness of Tipu Sultan, something that history really hasn't spent time considering. Right after this. Tipu, as we all know, famously courted the French. He saw them as an equal ally who would help him combat the inequity of any alliance with the British, who considered themselves superior and above any Indian. Tipu knew that Mysore alone would find it hard to thwart the advance of the British, because the Marathas and the Nizam of Hyderabad would fight alongside the British to give them control over Mysore. And Tipu knew, therefore, that he had to court the French. In 1788, Tipu sent 3 ambassadors to the court of Louis XVI or Louis XVI at Versailles, and what followed was a very interesting and most entertaining part of history. The ambassadors were Muhammad Darvesh Khan, Akbar Ali Khan, and Muhammad Osman Khan. This was the most ambitious diplomatic mission in Mysore's history. The arrival of the ambassadors in Paris created not just a stir, but a cultural sensation. When the Mysoreans arrived in Paris on the 16th of July 1788, the city went wild, it went nuts. Parisians crowded the balconies of the Rue Saint-Honoré just to catch a glimpse of their silk turbans and jewel-encrusted sword belts. The Journal de Paris reported on their whereabouts almost every day. And then, one of the most famous painters of the day, Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun, the court painter to Marie Antoinette, was so struck by their bearing that she formally requested permission to paint their portraits. The ambassadors initially refused to be painted, and they cited religious and cultural reasons. They only agreed after Vigée-Lebrun pulled strings to have the king Louis XVI himself formally request Mohammad Darwish Khan, the head of the ambassadors, to agree to the sitting. The result was a now famous portrait titled Portrait of Mohammad Darwish Khan. Now, this painting itself has a very interesting history. Once she had finished painting it, Lebrun left it with the ambassador for it to dry. But when she asked for it back to display it, Darwish and the team refused, saying that every portrait needed a soul, and so he took the painting and hid it behind his bed. Vigée-Lebrun then bribed a personal valet of the ambassadors and recovered the painting. When an enraged Darwish wanted to execute his valet, he was reminded that this was against the law in France. Lebrun also had lied to them that the king wanted the portrait to be publicly displayed, so they had to capitulate. Eventually, the painting was displayed in 1789 at the Salon de Paris, which was considered to be the greatest art exhibition of its time. And 230 years later, in 2019, this very portrait was sold for just over $7 million at Sotheby's. In Paris, the Mysore ambassadors were celebrated, to put it mildly. Paris was enchanted. The struggle of a South Indian kingdom against the British had become a fashionable cause in the salons of Versailles. The day that the ambassadors arrived in Paris was almost exactly 1 year before the storming of the Bastille, the most significant moment of the French Revolution. But at the time, the ambassadors were fascinated equally, although occasionally bewildered, by France. At the opera, they were reportedly less interested in the music and the performance than in the machinery that was used to move the stage sets. At the port of Brest, they insisted on examining every piece of mechanisms of the vessels that they were shown. This was not incidental. Tipu had instructed his envoys to recruit large numbers of craftsmen, clockmakers, porcelain workers, glass makers, arms manufacturers from the royal foundries of France. He wanted to bring European technology home to Mysore. The attention his ambassadors paid to the machinery at the opera was a direct extension of his own pronounced thirst for European knowledge. Tipu was a man who owned thermometers, barometers, and telescopes, and he was not sending ambassadors to Versailles to enjoy the ballet. The mission's principal objective was actually a formal military alliance. He wanted 10,000 French troops under Mysorean command. But instead, what the embassy got was warm words and 30 craftsmen. The reason I mentioned the date of the French Revolution was because the French court was already sliding towards the revolution. Its finances were in crisis. Its domestic stability was disintegrating. Louis XVI could not commit troops to a war on the other side of the world when he could barely maintain order in Paris. So the embassy returned to Srirangapatna in May 1789, the same month that Louis XVI had summoned the États Généraux that would within weeks become the National Assembly that dismantled the French monarchy. Tipu Sultan's reactions when his ambassadors returned empty-handed was extraordinary, and this is where the story takes a very dark turn. Tipu was enraged, not at the French at this time, but at his own men. Reports had reached him that the ambassadors had spoken glowingly, admiringly of French power and splendor, and this was in violation of his strict instructions to behave in a diplomatic manner. By doing this, Tipu Sultan believed that the ambassadors had conducted themselves as supplicants to France rather than emissaries of a sovereign equal. So the punishment? He ordered the beheading of Akbar Ali Khan and Muhammad Osman Khan. Only Mohammad Darvesh Khan, the senior ambassador, the man whose portrait Lebrun painted, escaped execution but received severe reprimand. There is no diplomatic framing or explanation that can accommodate this. This was cruelty. The cruelty of a man whose reign was marked by sudden, selective acts of harsh punishment that fell without warning on those closest to him. His own ambassadors this time, his own commanders at times, large numbers of the people of Malabar on another occasion. The pattern is consistent enough that it cannot be explained away as the pressure of war or the paranoia of isolation. It was simply who he was, in equal measure, brilliant, visionary, and capable, and in the same breath, capable of a ruthlessness that bordered on the psychopathic. And now we come to the matter of the fateful letter. This was not the letter that Tipu had written to Louis XVI, referenced in the last episode, but a letter that came to Tipu Sultan, or rather, a letter that was meant to come to Tipu Sultan, but never did. By 1798, the French monarchy was gone and Napoleon Bonaparte was in charge. Now, he was in Egypt with the grand ambition of eventually reaching India and expelling the British. Napoleon wrote to Tipu from his headquarters in Cairo in early 1799, addressing him as the most magnificent Sultan and our greatest friend. The letter read, "You have already been informed of my arrival on the borders of the Red Sea, with an innumerable and invincible army, full of the desire of delivering you from the iron yoke of England. I eagerly embrace this opportunity of testifying to you the desire I have of being informed by you, by way of Muscat and Mocha, as to your political situation. I would even wish you could send some intelligent person to Suez or Cairo, possessing your confidence, with whom I may confer. May the Almighty increase your power and destroy your enemies. Signed, Bonaparte." The British intercepted the letter. Richard Wellesley read it. He knew, with cool, strategic assessment, that Napoleon was still marooned in Egypt, that no French army would reach India in time for it to matter. But the letter was a windfall for the British. It confirmed, in Napoleon's own words, the French alliance that Wellesley had long cited as his justification for the war against Mysore. He used it as evidence of a dangerous conspiracy. He used it to declare war on Mysore. Tipu Sultan died on May 4, 1799, at the storm of Seringapatam. He lay under a heap of the slaughtered, never knowing that Napoleon had written to him, never knowing that even the letter existed, never knowing that the alliance that he had spent 15 years pursuing had, at the very last moment, been within reach, that the British had simply taken away from him. The measure, Tipu Sultan was the most powerful ruler of the South. He had done everything a ruler without the sea could do. But he had no friends, only followers. And when the walls fell, those followers surrendered or fled. If he had any friends, they may well have warned him as to what was to come. In the end, Tipu Sultan died as he had lived, in total and complete loneliness. This episode was about the measure of Tipu Sultan, but in the next episode, we return to the history of what happened with Tipu and after. And that is coming up very soon. I am Ramjee Chandran, and this is the history of Bangalore.